Okay, so hey, I'm Ali, and as was mentioned, I work in the London office. I'm a partner engineer on the games team, so I work with some of Europe's largest gaming partners to help integrate our technology into their games and drive them to success. I really love talking about mobile in gaming because I think it's just a really interesting portion of the games industry at large right now. Since the dawn of the iPhone in 2007, we've found a really interesting kind of development of the games industry. We've found new types of games being enabled by a touchscreen device that just couldn't have existed before. We've seen companies that have appeared out of nowhere to find great success on mobile, and companies that previously maybe were struggling to find success have a new renewed lease of life with kind of hits on mobile. I'd say Rovio is perhaps one of the best examples we have of that stuff. The second reason I really like talking about this is before coming to Facebook, I was a mobile social game developer myself. I had a small indie startup, me and one other guy, and we wrote a social game. We got that game into the top 10 of the iOS App Store with no marketing spend and nothing, so I'm kind of proud of that personally. But it makes me aware just how hard it is to get a game there in the first place and how exceptionally hard it is to keep it there. It's really painful when you spend months, maybe even a year of your time, tweaking, making everything pixel perfect. You release it, and then it just gets swallowed up in a week, 2 weeks, because there's so much competition. The native app stores do a really great job of featuring apps, but they can't feature everyone. And so any additional distribution that you can embed into your game to try and drive more traffic is really, really valuable. And so that's what we're going to kind of focus on today. So really, what are the goals for the mobile social games developer when dealing with Facebook? Really, I think it kind of revolves around two things. The first is acquisition. How do we get extra players into our app in the first place? And we have technology around invites, requests that kind of bring players in and get them downloading your app in the first place. The second one is engagement. There's a statistic which I find really amazing, which says that 50% of games apps that are downloaded onto iPhones are played once and once only. So the player will download it, launch it, close it, forget about it, and it's gone. It's really hard to turn those sorts of players into long-term, sustainable value for your business. So anything you can do to extend the life of that player within your game, to keep them playing for longer, to keep them coming back, playing longer sessions, is really important in trying to turn them into monetizing value for your business. So this isn't just kind of hyperbole. We're seeing really great statistics to back this kind of stuff up. Wooga's Diamond Dash, Wooga's a European partner of ours, and they've reported some really great statistics by embedding our technology within their game. Their game Diamond Dash on iOS, they state that Facebook-connected users are 8 times more likely to spend within the game than their non-Facebook connected counterparts. And in addition, of those users that do spend, there's a 50% increase in the amount that's spent in the game compared to non-Facebook connected users. And this is because they get the social context of being connected to Facebook. It just makes them more engaged. A more recent example is Songpop. I don't know about you, but I'm addicted to this game. I think I'm perhaps the world's best player at 90s Alternative, so if anyone wants to try me, bring it on. Fresh Planet, the developers behind Songpop, report that 65%, so nearly 2/3 of users, choose to connect to their social context. And this makes sense, right? The game is much more interesting when you're playing against friends. And they report that Facebook-connected users spend 35% more time and, really the thing that we're interested in, more money in the game than their non-Facebook-connected counterparts. It's not just phones. We're also dealing with tablets here. BitRhyme's Bingo Bash is a great example of an iPad game that reports the same sort of thing. On average, they say a Facebook-connected user plays 30% longer and 65% more sessions than a non-Facebook-connected user. And again, this speaks to the earlier point about trying to extend the life of these players within your game, bring them back, make them play more sessions, and turn them into monetizing value. And yeah, they spend 80% more in game than non-Facebook users. And there's really only a few kind of key technologies that you really need to embed to get going with this stuff, and it makes a really dramatic difference to the metrics and the bottom line. So it's really valuable and worth thinking about. Okay, so what are we going to do today? Well, I have this game called Friend Smash, which we've built as a sample of some of the stuff that you can do on iOS. It's completely open source. Everything you see today is fully available on GitHub and our FB samples page, so I encourage you to download it, use it as boilerplate, use it to start, or follow along today. This is I know I'm in the Android room here, but this is a iOS talk that I'll be giving today. But if you are an Android developer, don't fall asleep. Everything I talk about is completely pertinent to you too. The code will look slightly different, but the feeling behind it is identical. Our SDKs, you've probably heard already, are kind of at parity, so everything should work the same on Android. And we actually have an Android version of FriendSmash coming. It's in the pipeline, so you should see that appear in the GitHub samples in the next coming weeks. OK, so without further ado, I will give you a demo of the game. Let me run it here. OK, if any of you have played Fruit Ninja, you'll know the concept. When I hit play, what's going to happen is celebrities are going to pop up onto the screen, and I'm tasked with smashing a particular celebrity. If I miss that celebrity 3 times, or if I hit the wrong celebrity, the game finishes, and I'm kind of put back to the home screen. So let's give it a go. So I hit play. OK, I've got to smash Arnie. It's actually quite a lot harder with a trackpad than with my finger, but still. So smashing him, the score's going up. Oh, I accidentally hit Jackson, and that's the end of the game, right? So I scored 11 points, and then I'm back to the start. That's kind of fun. Like, it's not bad, but it could be a lot more interesting. What if we made this game social? What if I had pictures of my friends popping up? What if I would smash them instead? And what if they were notified that I've smashed them? This would be much more engaging and more interesting for me as the player. So that's what we're going to go ahead and do. OK, so what we're going to cover today, there's a few things. We're first going to set up the SDK and do Facebook login. You've probably already seen this done in some of the other sessions today, so I'm going to kind of go through that bit quite quickly and get on to the other stuff that's kind of more game-specific. Next, we're going to focus on requests, which are a one-to-one communication channel between players in your game. So this is me as an individual player, notifying you that I've done something within the game. Then we'll touch on feed. Feed is a broadcast mechanism, so it's me posting on my timeline, showing it to all my friends in one go. And we tend to use this in games for bragging, for showing off, effectively. You've heard about the Open Graph today a lot, I'm sure, so I'm not going to go over everything there. But there's a couple of game-specific APIs kind of within the Open Graph kind of section that I'm going to touch on. These revolve around scores and achievements, which are kind of what they say on the tin. Scores are a way of ranking players in your game. And achievements are kind of one-off stories, things that your player can earn within your game, which will show up on their timeline. And we'll touch on those. And then lastly, I know today is a mobile day, but if you're a game developer that has a game spanning multiple platforms, we have some really key technologies that you can embed to kind of leverage your existing audience when you bring them across to mobile. So I'll touch upon a few of those things. OK, so the first step is Facebook login. This is going to take an anonymous player. So when we just played the game had no idea who I was, so they couldn't show me anything personalized. It's going to put them through a textless Facebook login flow. And this is important for a mobile game. You don't want to be having your player entering their email address and password on a phone. It's somewhat tedious, and the drop-off rates are huge. If you can get them through a textless-based login, it's going to be much more seamless. And then once we have them there, we're going to know their identity, and more importantly, we're going to know their social context. So we're going to know their friends, know who they want to play against, and we can show that in the game. So let's go ahead and build it out. The first step is the Facebook developer site, and I'm sure you've seen this today, so I'm going to whiz through this stuff. First up, you need a bundle ID. This is Apple's canonical representation of an app within the iOS environment. You need to make sure that it's the same here as you state in Xcode, and that's so we can hook up login in the way that you would expect. You also need to enter an App Store, an App Store ID for the iPhone and the iPad. You don't need to do this when you're developing. This is really just when your app goes live. And it's so that in the case where a player tries to interact with your app and they don't have it installed, we can send them straight through to the native app store. So you can acquire a new user. So this is really powerful, and you want to make sure that you get it in there when your app is available. Facebook login, this is kind of the on-off switch for enabling our sort of technology within the game. Once you enable it, we'll start driving traffic to your app through requests, through feed, through a mobile bookmark, and we'll touch upon some of that stuff later. Deep linking is a method I think you've seen demonstrated earlier today, which links the player through to a specific piece of context within the app. So an example might be if I see a friend playing a Spotify song or a SoundCloud song. If I click on that link on mobile, I don't want to be taken to the home screen of that app. I want to be taken to that particular song. And there are examples within games where this works really well as well. In Angry Birds Friends, if you beat a player and you beat their score, you can brag about it onto their timeline. If they then interact with that story, they're taken through to that exact level that you just beat them on to try and challenge you back. So you can create these really great viral loops, bringing players back into the game and linking them to specific content within your game. Lastly, there's this URL suffix section, and I'll explain this in a second because it's kind of pertinent to game developers, especially on iOS. So once we've done that, we then set up our app in Xcode. I'm really going to go through this very quickly. I've imported the SDK, the framework here. I've changed a few settings. I've enabled SQL, etc. And then a couple of points to note here. Firstly, I've got my Facebook app ID. I've inserted it into my plist here. This is the app ID that Facebook gives you in the developer site. And then there's this URL scheme, which is FB and then the app ID. And this is so that we can use the Facebook native app to launch your app. And this is the mechanism by which we do it through iOS. So once we've set all that up, we can now start to make actual code changes. And so all the code that I'm going to work on today is in this one file called Game Controller Facebook Integration. So I'm going to drop into here, and then this is the file that we'll be working on for the remainder of this talk. So I'll just get rid of the drawer, give us a bit more room. So right now, when the game calls this FB create session method, and right now I just set the game into a non-social state and return. I don't do anything. I'm going to comment out that code now, and instead I'm going to replace it with these two lines here that create a session and just set it as the active session. So this session has nothing enabled yet. We haven't logged the player in. It's kind of a blank, empty canvas where we can start, authenticating the player. Once that session is created, the game is then going to call FB login, which is going to do the following things. It's going to ask the user for some permissions, and I'm sure you've heard this talked about earlier today. We're just going to simply ask for the email permission right now. And again, this is a read permission. We've talked before about splitting now in iOS 6 and our new SDKs. You're having to ask the player for read and publish permissions separately. And we feel that this increases user trust, improves click-through rates. So that's what we're going to do here. We're just going to ask for a read permission. And then we're going to open this session. If the opening is OK, so if the user didn't say no or didn't cancel, then we drop into here. Now, our SDKs are in kind of a transitory state right now. Some of the game-specific technology that we use, like the request dialog, uses an older web-based version of our SDK. And we are required, therefore, to initialize that version of the SDK here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this old-school kind of Facebook object from the previous version of the SDK. And I'm going to give it the access token and expiry date that we've got from our new active session. And I just have to do this once, and then it's set up, and we can use the web-based dialogues, and I'll touch upon that later in the talk. If that's all ready to go, and everything's gone OK, then I'm going to update the home screen of the game to show some social state. So I'm going to download my picture, my name, and I'm going to show it front and center. So hopefully, we compile and run. I now replace, because I've put the game into kind of this social state now, I've replaced that play button with a login with Facebook button, which is going to trigger this code. So when I do this, it's going to create the session and then try and log that session in. So if I click the button, because I'm on iOS 6 here on the simulator, this is the native login flow. So no longer are we doing that fast app switch that I'm sure you've all seen. We're just prompting the user natively. It's super seamless, super fast to allow access to my public data, basically. My list of friends, etc. So if I say OK, the game's now going to update the screen, and there we are. There's my picture, there's my name, and we're ready to go. I've also made changes that instead of picking a celebrity, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pick as the target of the smashing a random friend. So I'm going to download my friend list, I'm going to pick one at random, and I'm going to make that download their image and make that the subject. So if I hit play, let's see what happens. OK, so I'm smashing my friend Ellie. It was Ellie's birthday yesterday, so I'm sure she'll be happy to see this. OK, so the game works the same way. If I accidentally hit a celebrity, it ends. Right, now, I've got this posting to OpenGraph as posting a score, and we'll touch upon this later in the talk. But because I haven't done this before, it's now asking me, do I allow write permissions? Do I allow the game to publish back to the OpenGraph on my behalf? So I'm going to say yes here, and that's going to go ahead and do it seamlessly in the background. You can actually see that I log it down here. So it says that I've reauthorized with publish permissions. The code to do that is really straightforward. I'll show you it very quickly. If I can find it, in fact. OK, here. So I've got a static bool which just says, have we requested before? And the reason I do this is so that this doesn't pop up the dialog while I'm playing the game. It kind of waits until the end. And then I just say, reauthorize with publish permissions, and then that turns this session that I currently have as active, but only with read permissions, into one with write permissions. And then that's what you need to do. You just need to do it once, and then the game holds on to that for the remainder. OK, so that's the game, and this is much more fun, right? I mean, I've got my friend here. You know, it's more interesting to me as a player. I'm playing with my friends. So it's a really good start to starting to make this game social. Oh yeah, I touched on this before. In the developer app, there was that section called URL scheme suffixes, and I mentioned that I would talk about what this is for. This is used in the situation where a developer has two versions of their app available on the store. Typically, for game developers, you have a free version and a paid version. And you know, the normal flow that a user might go through is they'll download the free version, they'll play it, they'll enjoy it, and then they'll decide that they want to go back and buy the paid version. So now you have two apps, potentially, on the user's phone. And we as Facebook, in the native app, need to know which one of those apps to launch when a player interacts with some content on Facebook. We do this through this URL scheme suffixes system. Basically, what you do is when you create the session, as you saw me do before, there's an additional parameter that you pass in, and you give it a token. In this case, we're giving it the token free. And then you define in your settings of your app which one of the various versions that you might have this one is. So it says FB and then the app ID, and then we prepend it with the suffix of that URL. In the developer app, you then add these two tokens, as it were, and the order that you add them is the order that we will try and launch them. So if you see here, it says paid and then free. So what that will mean is when we try and, when a user interacts with that content within the native app, we will try and launch the paid app, and we'll do that with, trying to launch the URL FB, then the app ID, and then paid. If that fails, we will then try and launch the free version. And if that fails, we will then drop them all the way back to the App Store. So this is a way that you can, if you do have multiple apps on the store, this is the way that you can make sure that that flow all works correctly. OK, so then we created a session, hooked up login, and we were ready to go. There's a few best practices that we see as partner engineers working with lots of games partners that work really well, so it's important to touch upon them. Firstly is make the Facebook login button prominent. Don't hide it in a settings menu somewhere or make it difficult to find. Put it front and center. I mean, you've seen from some of the stats I presented that having a Facebook logged in user is really valuable, potentially, to your game. So, make it really obvious and make the flow really straightforward for your users. Secondly, upsell on the value of connecting. Think about me as a player. If I'm going to give some data about myself away to you as an app, what do I get in return? And so, with the case of Songpop, I get to play with my friends. I get to be part of a tournament. I get to, interact with people that I know. So make that obvious. Let your players know what they're going to get in your game if they do hook it up to Facebook. And lastly, bring in your users' friends by default. There's no need for you to create a new social graph within your app. You already have the one that's, pertinent to me as a player, my Facebook graph. So don't make the players do any more work to kind of make friends within your game or anything. Just use the connections that you've already got, and you have this data available fully to you. You saw this with Friend Smash, right? I didn't have to do anything extra. My friends are just available for me to play within the game. OK, so now we've hooked up Facebook login. There are some things that our app gets just by having done those 10 lines of code. The first one is, we get the user's credentials. We get their name, their profile picture, their list of friends, etc. We get a bookmark in the native app, the native Facebook app. So just by doing this stuff, Friend Smash now has a bookmark on the left-hand rail of the Facebook native app. So it will show up there, requests will show up, etc. And we find that this drives really good amounts of traffic, so it's really useful to get in on it. It also appears in search. So if your players have heard about your app through word of mouth, they go in, they start searching for it, it will show up. And lastly, but I think perhaps most importantly, you get this access to additional distribution. And when it's so hard to stay on top of the app stores, any additional distribution you can gain is really important. So we're going to touch upon that now. We're really talking, when I say distribution, about our social channels. And I know that you've heard somewhat about this in some of the other talks today. The social channels on mobile are exactly the same as they are on Canvas. We have requests, which I mentioned are a one-to-one communication between users. So this is really useful if you have a game where perhaps you're going back and forth, like a turn-based game like Scrabble. Requests are perfect for that, for passing kind of your turn messages back and forth. This lights up the notification jewel, shows up, send a push notification on mobile, really powerful. Next is feed. This is a one-to-many broadcast mechanism. So this will show up on my timeline, show up in my friends' news feeds. We use this for bragging. And the Open Graph. Again, I'm not going to dive too much into the Open Graph today, but there are scores and achievements APIs, which I will touch upon, which are purpose-built for games. Now, whichever social channel we talk about, requests, feed, or the Open Graph, the flow from the user is the same. If they interact with some content in the Facebook native app, and the app that they are interacting with is installed, we will launch them straight into that app. And we can do that with deep linking so they can get launched into a specific piece of content. But if, and I think this is really powerful, if the user does not have the app installed, we'll send them straight through to that page of the App Store, which is just fantastic for user acquisition, right? This is a great way of getting extra users to see your App Store page. Can I do questions at the end? Or? Okay, so we're going to dive into each one of these things now, and I'm going to build them out. So we'll start with requests. So there are lots of use cases for requests. The typical ones we see are invites, gifting, maybe trying to compete in missions or competitions. There's basically lots of ways that you can use this within your game. The flow works like this. You pop up this web-based request dialog for sending. The receiving user gets a push notification from Facebook, so it buzzes in their pocket, and you see really high engagement through push notifications. Swipe it will launch the native Facebook app and will light up the notification jewel. Click that, it will appear in the notification list. And then tap on that, and it will go to one of those places. It will either launch the app or go through to the App Store. And it's also important to note this is entirely cross-platform. So if you have a game that's maybe on the web and on iOS, you send a request on the web, it will show up on iOS, and vice versa, Android to iOS. You know, whichever platforms that you have your game on, this works across them, and is a really great way of driving users, driving traffic across your multiple kind of platforms. This is a video which is not actually game-specific, but I think really highlights the flow, and so it's worth showing. There's two users here, two phones. The guy on the right is using this app called Bonsai, and he wants to invite his friend in to use the app with him. So it's logged in through Facebook, so it has a complete list of his friends. It's going to go down and pick a friend called Dave Schatz. Spawns this request dialog to send Dave a message, hit send. A few seconds later, and this was all filmed in real time, so there's no trickery here. This is just how it works publicly. Dave receives a push notification. We now store his password, but anyway. Launches the Facebook native app. Notification shows up, clicks through. Now, he doesn't have Bonsai installed, so we can't launch the app. Instead, we take him through to the App Store and hits install, and there we go. He's got the app, downloading and being installed. If you think about typically how you might share apps between friends through word of mouth, maybe they don't know how they spell it exactly, they can't find it on the App Store, it can be kind of tricky to acquire a new user. Whereas here, in about a minute or less, there's a fully engaged new user connected up, logging in through Facebook, getting that social context, and then this chain continues. So our request channel is a really great way of acquiring new users, bringing them into your game. So implementation of requests is really straightforward. There's 4 lines of code here, but I guess what's best if I just dive in and do it. So I don't know if you saw at the end of Friend Smash, but I replaced the kind of just play button again with some extra buttons to send a challenge and send a brag. What we're going to do in Friend Smash is I'm going to challenge a friend using request to say, hey, I scored however many points in the game. Can you come back and beat me? The code that's going to get executed is still in this file. And it's called SendRequest. I'll just walk through it here. There's quite a bit here, but I'll talk through the various bits. But the bit to concentrate on is at the bottom here. We create a dictionary of parameters, which is just a key-value pair. And the only thing we need, actually, is a message. So just what are we going to send through to our friend? So we're going to say, I just smashed X number of friends. Can you beat it? And then when we have that dictionary, we're then going to spawn this dialog called app requests using the older Facebook SDK object, and that's all there is to it to enable this functionality. It's actually just 2 statements of code. So if I run the game and play another round, I'll score no points this time, which is not a great challenge, but anyway. So I now have this challenge button. If I hit that, it's going to execute that code that we've just seen. So I hit challenge, and it will spawn the request dialog. Now, because I've provided no extra parameters here, this is just doing a flat list of my friends. So I can pick from a friend selector here of people that I typically interact with, and I'll send them a request. I see Colin's in the room, so I'm going to send him a request. And hopefully, if the demo gods are on our side, he should get a push notification. Any luck? He does. Yeah? Nice. So there you go. So now if Colin swipes that through, he'll launch the Facebook app. Maybe he doesn't have FriendSmash installed. I don't know why he would be so crazy, but anyway. And then you get taken through to the App Store, and I've acquired a new user. So that's cool, but perhaps I don't want a flat list of my friends. Perhaps I'm in a game kind of doing something one-on-one with one other player. Like maybe I'm in Scrabble and I'm playing back and forth with one other person. In that case, we don't want the player to have to pick who they want to send the request to. We want to pre-populate that for them. And we do that very simply by adding a to-parameter in the dictionary that we provide for our request dialog method. So this is my Facebook user ID, and therefore, when we run the game again and go through the same flow, instead of showing that friend selector, it's just going to pre-populate it, sending me a message. I realize it doesn't make much sense me challenging myself, but bear with me. Okay. You'd think the internet here would be one of the stablest I've come across, but I'll try again. Okay. So I'll score a few points. Use the game. So now I hit challenge. It skips that friend selector bit and pre-populates the dialog, sending me a message. Hit send, and my phone will receive a push notification. Another common scenario we see when sending requests is maybe you don't want to be able to select everyone. Maybe you don't want to send a message through to just a request through to just one person. You have a party of people that you want to play with. So maybe these are people that you're in a competition with, you're in a clan with. There are various scenarios that this could work within your game. We do this through a suggested friends method. So what this will do is it will kind of pre-populate that friend selector with people that we suggest. So what I've done here is it's very simple. I've got an array of Facebook user IDs. These are obviously hard-coded, but you would use these contextually within your game, depending on what you're doing. And then I pass in as an extra parameter, this suggestions parameter, with that array. Go through the same flow. You're probably going to get sick of seeing me play this game. So now it's populated it with 4 people, these 4 user IDs I've selected: Gareth, Julien, Will, and Gabriella. And so, I would send messages through to these people, and they would be able to interact with the ways that we've already demonstrated. So that's requests. There's a few kind of pro tips that we tend to talk about when we're dealing with requests that we find work really well within some of our partner games. The first is frictionless requests. I mentioned before that you're in a scenario when you're kind of going back and forth, maybe in a turn-based game. You don't necessarily want to pop that request box each and every time. It's somewhat invasive and disruptive to the user's gameplay. So we have this technology called frictionless requests. It's one line of code. You simply say frictionless requests is true. And what will happen is the request dialog will then show this extra parameter, this extra checkbox, which says, don't ask again before sending requests to these friends in this app. So once you go through the dialog flow once, and then you try and send an extra request to that player again in the future, the dialog won't spawn. It will just send the request seamlessly. The player won't be interrupted. And this is a really good enabling technology for increasing the rate of requests and the rate of interaction between your players. The second pro tip is customize the request dialog. You don't have to use ours. Ours carries our kind of Chrome and our branding, but maybe it makes more sense within your game to use your art. If you built the dialog box natively, you'll see better performance than our kind of web-based ones. And we just find that this creates better results with our partner apps. They see better engagement when they do this. The third pro tip I want to touch on is device filtering. Now, let's say I have an iOS game. It doesn't make any sense for me to send requests through to my friends that only have Android devices because, they'll see the request and they won't be able to do anything with it. They'll just get an error message at some point which says, this game is not available on Android. It doesn't make much sense. So we have this ability to filter your friends by device. So you only target the friends with the device of the platform of your game. You can do this through the Graph API. It's really simple. You just specify devices as a field when you're asking for data about your friends. And you can build this into your friend selector to, to kind of customize the experience. So it sounds kind of convoluted, but I'll demo it to show you just how easy it is. So what I'm going to do is, instead of sending a request, when this method gets called, I'm instead going to send a filtered request, which is this method below. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a list of my friends, and I'm going to filter the friends that have an iOS device, and I'm going to ignore the ones that have an Android device. Right now, FriendSmash is only available on iOS, so this makes sense. So what I'm going to do is create an array of my device-filtered friends. These are my friends that only have an iOS device. I'm going to ask the Graph API for my list of friends, and I'm going to ask for their name and the list of devices that they have. If that comes back and there's no errors or results in this completion handler, and in the data method you saw Eddie touch upon, we bundle everything up into a data array. I'm then going to loop through my friends, assuming my friend count is greater than 0, and look for devices. For each friend, I'm going to extract out their devices that they have here, and I'm going to look for the string iOS. So this is either an iPhone or an iPad. And if they have an iOS device, I'm then going to add them to this array, the device-filtered friends. So at this point, after that kind of loop is done, I now have a list of my friends with an iOS device. Now, if you remember before, I had 4 friends, my suggested friends I wanted to send a request to, and these are their same user IDs here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to then loop through these suggested friends, these friends that I want to send a request to, and I'm going to compare them against the list of my iOS friends. I'm going to say, okay, well, if they are in that list, if my suggested friends do have an iOS device, I then add them to my device-filtered friends. And then when that's all finally done, I'll have a list of my friends that I want to send a request to with iOS devices, and I can use that list to populate the request dialog. So I hope that made sense and you followed it. Let's give it a go. So I'll play one more round. Try again. Okay. Score a few points. Hit challenge. Okay, so now my suggested friends is only 3 big, and that's because Gabriella, who was in the list before, doesn't have an iOS device. She only has an Android phone. And so, it makes sense that I only want to target these people. And so it's really straightforward to do this, and it makes for a much better experience for your players, that will only see the request if they can go ahead and play the game. It's also worth noting you can experiment with this stuff in our Graph API Explorer, which is a really fantastic tool for playing with the Graph API. This is, if I just do like a list of my friends here, you'll see it will bring down data about my friends. If I specify devices, what is going on? Let's try that again, bear with me.
Your session's expired.
Yeah, okay. Start again. Okay, so, can't type. There we go, got there in the end. Okay, so there's my list of friends, and I can additionally add fields, name, devices. And eventually, you'll get a list of your friends and the devices that they have. So you can use this to target them. There we go. We currently break out iPad and iPhone. We don't break out Android at the moment. There's a discussion about that. But this is just useful for targeting the platforms in general. Cool. So that's requests, a one-to-one communication channel between friends in your game. We'll now move on to feed. So as I mentioned before, this is a one-to-many communication channel. This is me talking to all my friends at once. And so there are fairly limited use cases within games where this makes sense. A typical common one we see is bragging. You do really well in a film, in a level, and you want to brag to your friends about it. This works exactly the same on mobile as it does on Canvas. We'll publish to a user's timeline and appear in your friend's newsfeed. And unlike the Open Graph, this is unstructured content. So this is a free message. It carries no extra kind of data. The flow works like this. This is the iOS 6 native share sheet, which I'm sure you've seen touched upon earlier today. Hit post, and it will appear on my timeline. It's nice and big, the art's nice and big, can be really engaging, has a lot of real estate on timeline, and we find drives a lot of traffic. And then your friends can comment. In this case, they can berate me about my terrible ability. And so we show that this works really well. Much like requests, implementation is really easy. It's basically the same. We just invoke a different dialog. There's a few extra lines of code, but it's really pretty straightforward. So I'll go ahead and demo that as well. So you saw there was this brag button as well at the end of Friend Smash when you finish a level. That executes the code that's here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the new iOS 6 methodology of sharing the native share sheet. So pretty straightforward. I'm just going to provide some text, an image, URL. In fact, I'm going to ignore that for right now. And that's literally all it is. This one line here is all you need to pop the dialog. So we'll give it a go. Hit play. Hit brag. And there it is. It's native, it's instantaneous, takes no extra effort. Hit post, and that will appear on my timeline. My friends can interact with it. And again, if they click on that story, they'll be taken to the App Center if they don't have the app installed, or they'll launch back into Friend Smash. Really straightforward. There we go. It's also worth noting that you don't have to do this through the dialog. We also have an API, so you can do this through your own methodology. You can build out your own user flows as you would with requests. This does require the publish actions permission, sorry. So you have to request write permissions on behalf of your user. But the configuration parameters are identical as they are for requests as the feed through the dialog. So a message, a picture, description, a caption. Now, I touched upon it earlier, but it's worth kind of recapping. Deep linking, this ability to link to a specific piece of content within your app. To recap, feed and timeline stories will go through to the app, it will launch, and by default it will just go to whatever the home screen of the app is that you provide. But it's much more interesting from a player's point of view to launch through to that specific content. So rather than, if my friend Gareth here challenges me, rather than going through to the home screen, I want to go and smash Gareth back. Right? It's much more interesting. The way that we do this is pretty straightforward. We just add this extra link parameter when we spawn the feed dialog. The link can be whatever you want it to be. The important thing in Friend Smash here is this challenge brag bit at the end. What I'm doing is I'm embedding in my link the challenging Facebook ID of that player. So if it was me challenging, saying, I've scored X number of points, can you beat me? That link will have my Facebook ID in it. And when the game opens up, the user is passed in from the Facebook native app via one of these stories, the game can then parse that URL and extract that ID and then use that as the subject of the smashing. So we'll go ahead and demo it. I haven't got the iOS native app installed here on my simulator, so I can't demo the showing it the full flow. But what I'll do is I'll just show the incoming URL. So when the game receives an incoming URL, this function is called. And again, you can follow this. You can download the sample and really dig in if you need to, fully follow the flow. So all we're going to do is we're going to take this URL, this challenge brag, and we're going to extract out the last object, which is our Facebook user ID. We're then going to use that user ID to request a bit more, extra information about that player, their name, because we need to say, smash, the player's name, and their profile picture. And then we start the game with them as the subject of the smashing. It's almost no code and works really well. I've got a demo of the flow as a video. It shows how it works. So here I'm on my timeline in the Facebook native app. I hit that story, it launches Friend Smash, and it passes me straight into the game to smash Ali. So this is a way that you can link players to specific content within your app and kind of drive engagement. I mentioned before that there's not a huge amount of cases where it makes sense to necessarily use the feed dialog in your game. So you want to pick really interesting interactions that your player takes in your game and make those shareable. The Sims use this really great one where two Sims that have been playing together for a long time, woohoo, they prompt the player to share that. And they find great great kind of distribution through these stories, great engagement because people like sharing this stuff. It's very classy. So if you think about from the player's point of view, what are the interesting interactions within your game that they might choose to share? What would they want to show off to their friends, and how is it best to show that? So that's feed. I'm now going to touch on scores and achievements, which is part of the Open Graph that is built specifically for games. Firstly is the Graph API for scores. This is a really straightforward API. It couldn't be much more simple. You publish a single integer score per player within your game, and Facebook does the rest. It will generate high score stories, passing stories. These will show up on timeline and newsfeed and will drive really great additional distribution. They look like this. Here my friend Matt beat my high score in Friend Smash. So at the end of Friend Smash, I published my score, and Matt went ahead and beat me. Facebook generated this story. Now obviously I can't let one of my friends beat me at a game I made, so I went back and beat my high score. Facebook generated this story, which appeared on my timeline. It says that I have a new high score. It gives me my new high score on my old score. So I thought I was doing really well, but alas, my friend Tom came along, beat us both, and Facebook generated this story with 3 of us. And this stuff is happening with no work from me as a developer. I literally do one publish, one HTTP post with the user score. Facebook does the rest. It also shows up in other places in my recent activity on timeline. So this gets a good amount of real estate on Facebook.com and drives really great distribution. So I mentioned it's really straightforward. It's almost not worth demoing because it's literally one HTTP post. Here I'm creating a FB request with the graph path of the user's ID /scores. I'm posting that single integer score, and that's all there is to it. Now, in the past, we required an app access token to do this. So this had to happen on behalf of your app. And that meant typically you needed a server-side component to do this because you wouldn't want your players necessarily cheating. Or you wouldn't want to bundle your app ID and your app secret in your mobile app. We've now changed that. We've made it easier. So you can just use a user's app token to publish scores. So this can now happen directly from the client side, directly from the mobile. You don't have to have a server-side component. It just makes it a lot more simple. Now, as you've heard earlier today, not only can you write to the graph, it also makes sense to read from it. And this is true with scores as well. You do a simple get to your app ID scores with the user's access token, and it will bring back a social scoreboard. Now, what I mean by that is, I don't know about you, but if I go and play an old Xbox Live game, say, and I haven't played it for a couple of years, and I find that I'm 45,000th in a leaderboard, there's really no incentive for me to go and improve that. They're all strangers above me. It doesn't really matter. But if my leaderboard is just my friends, it's much more engaging, right? I want to go ahead and beat Tom. I want to beat my high score. And I want to get him back. So make this cool, and you'll get customized data for that player that you can then show in your game. And it's really, really engaging. An additional kind of system that we see work really well with some of our partners is the use case of tournaments. So rather than having this kind of leaderboard that exists in perpetuity, you create weekly tournaments, and you reset the scoreboards every week. It's way more interesting if I know that next week I have the chance to kind of get back, settle the score. We enable this by really simple HTTP deletes to these endpoints. You can either delete an individual score, or you can delete scores for all your players in one go. So this would be when you reset the tournament at the end of the week, ready for a new week. Okay, so that's scores. Really straightforward, really easy, and gets a great additional distribution. Now I'm going to touch on achievements. Achievements, again, are a specific API within the Open Graph made specifically for games. And they are kind of very rare, kind of one-off stories. A user can only achieve an achievement one time within your game. So you want to make them happen at kind of really interesting moments when the user is particularly proud of something they did within the game, something they earned. These publish on the user's timeline, again, show up in newsfeed, and they get good distribution. The way we use them is in 3 steps. First, we need to create our achievements. Then we register them with Facebook, so Facebook knows they exist. And then we publish them against the player, so a player can earn the achievement. OK, so here we're going to register this 50 achievements. This is when I score 50 points in Friend Smash. I managed to smash 50 players before losing all my lives. As with some of the Open Graph objects that you've seen, and I'm sure you've been through, you create them as an HTTP object on the web. they're marked up in exactly the same way as other OG objects. The only thing specific to note is there's this extra property, which is game::points. You get given, as an app, 1,000 points to distribute amongst achievements within your game. So this is attaching a value to each achievement. So maybe some achievements are worth more, maybe they're harder to get in your game than others. It makes sense to give them more distribution points. And we use this points, this weighting, to kind of weight distribution and how we show off these stories on Facebook. So here it's kind of a fairly low value thing. It's quite easy to score 50 points, so I'm giving it a 50-point score, as it were. So once we have that object created and on the web, we then need to register it with Facebook. This is really simple. It's a HTTP post to the graph, your app ID, achievements. You then state the URL of the achievement where Facebook can go and scrape that data. And obviously you need to do this just on behalf of your app, so it requires an app access token. At this point, the 100-point limit is enforced, so if you try and exceed that, you'll get an error back and you'll get some reasoning as to why. So once that is registered and Facebook knows about the achievement, players can then earn that achievement. And this will happen within your game. So once an achievement has been registered, the user can then post /me/achievements with the achievement URL, and then Facebook is aware that that user has earned that achievement and can generate those stories, which will show up on their timeline and in newsfeed. And they look something like this. This is one that I just pulled from my timeline this morning. It shows that I've had 3 achievements within Friend Smash. I scored 50 points, I scored 100 points, and I managed to smash 3 friends in one tap. And there's a couple of other ones from a couple of other games that have shown up there. And again, this is really great additional distribution. It's really straightforward to do, really easy, and drives extra traffic, which is so important for you as mobile games developers. The last point is cross-platform. And I know this is a mobile day, but this is important to note if you do have a game that spans multiple platforms. We live in this world where we all have different devices, different subsets of devices. And I don't want to have to think about what my friend has. Do they have an iPad, or do they have a Microsoft Surface, or do they have a whatever? I want to be able to just play with them. I don't really want to care. And it can be really difficult to link these devices together. But we feel that Facebook is kind of the only platform that exists ubiquitously across them all. And so it's a really good method that you can utilize to kind of drive traffic across these platforms and enable your players. The way to do this is really straightforward. It's simply use the same app ID within the developer settings. Don't create a different app for each version of your game on each platform. Instead, just extend the one app you have on Facebook to support multiple platforms. You see there are various sections of the dev site here. You saw me earlier fill out the native iOS app section because we were building for iOS. But there's the Android section here built out for Friend Smash, and when it comes onto the web, we'll fill out the Canvas section. What this means is we can drive traffic across these platforms. So a request sent on the web will show up on mobile and vice versa. I really want to pull out the example of how well this can work. One of the partners I work with in Europe is called King, and they have this popular game. It's very popular with kind of middle-aged women called Bubble Witch Saga. Super successful game on Canvas. They have 4.6 million daily active users. It's huge. And they're launching an iOS version. This happened a few months ago. But effectively, despite that success on Canvas, their iOS version, they're starting from scratch. How do we leverage that existing audience to make the iOS version, stand a better chance of success? The answer is really simple. We use the Facebook App ID. And the moment that we turned that Facebook login section on in the iOS section, these things happen that we talked about before. All their existing users, so everyone that's played the game on Canvas, all of those 4.6 million, that subsection that then have an iOS device immediately get a bookmark. It's like magic. It just shows up. And so there's immediately extra traffic being driven to that app through this mechanism. They also start seeing requests and notifications, drive traffic that we've talked about. And it allows them to build for their players a continuous experience. So the game is effectively, if you've played the game, it's effectively the same experience on mobile as it is on Canvas. It's obviously slightly tweaked for the smaller screen, but it's basically the same game. Facebook Connected players have all their progress synced. So they have where they've got in the game, the level that they're at, their friends' scores, and purchases that they've made in the game. So if they've bought an item on the web, they get access to that item on the phone. They can do this because they have everything synced with Facebook. And as the opposite of this, non-Facebook connected players have to start from scratch, and the experience really sucks. So just by enabling this stuff and turning it on, They get all this additional distribution, and the app was a success. They're doing really well on iOS. Okay, so a few takeaways. Facebook is the growth engine for Android and iOS apps. Games in particular do really well when you leverage some of this technology. Getting started is really simple. You saw that I wrote maybe 30 lines of code in this talk, and we got some really key technologies enabled to drive extra distribution. We have really effective social channels, and this stuff is cross-platform enabled, so it works across Android, across iOS, web, etc. Have some resources. There's the SDKs available on our developer site. I'm sure you've heard them talked about today. FriendSmash is, as I mentioned, on GitHub. Download it, play with it. We're going to continue building it as new stuff comes out, so it will always reflect kind of the latest stuff we're working on. And the documentation is really great now, especially the iOS section is really top-notch. So go and check it out. And with that, I'm done. Cheers.